The Blind Pianist's Triumph. At New York's Lincoln Arts Center, famous pianist Vincent Sterling spotted 16-year-old David Thompson standing nervously beside a Steinway grand piano, clutching his white cane. The blind teenager had come with his music teacher to an exclusive charity recital. "Hey kid, how about playing something for us?" Vincent's voice dripped with condescension as the elite audience chuckled. "I bet you know Happy Birthday." At 42, Vincent was considered one of the greatest Chopin interpreters, with sold-out world tours and million-dollar contracts. To him, this boy represented everything wrong with inclusion policies at cultural events. "Come on, don't be shy," Vincent insisted mockingly. "I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how we invest in diversity." What no one knew was that David spent 8 hours daily practicing on a borrowed keyboard in a church basement. At age 3, he could reproduce entire symphonies after hearing them once. And right now, he was memorizing every note of arrogance hanging in the air. "Actually," David said calmly, "I prefer Bach." Vincent laughed. "Bach? What piece could you possibly play?" "Partita No. 2 in C minor. But perhaps it's a little too advanced for this audience." The thick silence that followed made Vincent's irritation spike. The partita was one of Bach's most complex compositions, known for breaking experienced pianists. "Too advanced," Vincent repeated sharply. "You're speaking to people who finance the world's greatest orchestras." The audience murmured agreement. Margaret Rothschild, a banking heiress, whispered, "How rude. Someone needs to teach this generation manners." Vincent walked to the piano and played the opening bars with exaggerated theatrical movements. "You see, David, this requires not only technique but emotional maturity that takes decades to develop." What Vincent didn't know was that David had devoted every moment since losing his sight in the accident that killed his parents to music. His aunt worked as a cleaning lady at the music conservatory, giving him access to rare recordings and braille sheet music. He had memorized hundreds of pieces, studying not just notes but historical interpretations and emotional contexts. "Dr. Sterling," David said deliberately using the wrong title, "you played those bars in D major. Partita No. 2 is in C minor." I see silence. Vincent's face flushed. He had changed the key to test the boy, but hadn't expected to be corrected publicly. Obviously intentional, Vincent lied. "I was testing your ear." "I see," David replied calmly. "Then you must also know Bach composed this after his wife Maria Barbara's death. Each movement reflects a stage of mourning. Playing it correctly requires more than technique, it requires having known real loss." The statement hit Vincent hard. His interpretations had always been technically perfect but cold, lacking emotional depth. "Since you're so knowledgeable, how about showing us in practice?" Vincent snapped. David approached the piano, leaving his cane against the bench. "One question before I begin," he said, turning toward the audience. "Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild their soul note by note?" The silence shifted from discomfort to recognition. "Enough cheap philosophy," Vincent cut in. "Either play now or leave." David adjusted his position. "Actually, I'd like to demonstrate something, the difference between playing notes correctly and playing music." Vincent felt himself losing control. "Fine, I'll demonstrate first how the partita should be played by someone who actually studied music." As Vincent played with impressive technical precision, David closed his eyes and memorized every nuance, every stylistic choice, every micro pause, cataloging everything he could use. When Vincent finished to polite applause, David approached the bench. "Before I begin, I'd like you to know something. Bach composed this as a dialogue with grief. The first movement represents denial, the second is anger against God and fate." Vincent rolled his eyes. Any first-year student knows that basic context. David smiled. "You're right, but experiencing that pain personally, that changes everything." He placed his hands on the keys. "The difference between your interpretation and mine is not technical. You played the notes Bach wrote. I'm going to play the tears he shed." When David's hands touched the first notes, something magical happened. The same notes Vincent had played were transformed by lived experience, by real pain, by genuine loss. Dr. Webb leaned forward, whispering, "My God." In 40 years, he'd never heard such emotional depth. Vincent's legs trembled. The boy's technique wasn't just flawless, it was superior. Passages Vincent played with concentrated effort flowed from David's fingers like crystal clear water. Margaret Rothschild, who'd scoffed minutes earlier, now had tears streaming down her cheeks. David wasn't just playing the partita, he was retelling his story through it. The first movement became the narrative of a child who lost everything. The second, the rage of a teenager forced to navigate a world that saw him as inferior. "Vincent, drive," Webb whispered in awe. "This boy is one of the greatest natural talents I've ever witnessed." Vincent felt something shatter inside. This blind kid from the projects wasn't just better than him, he was better than any pianist Vincent had ever known. When David reached the climactic third movement, representing acceptance and transcendence, it took on an almost spiritual dimension. He was no longer playing for the audience but through them, connecting every person to the universal experience of loss and rebirth. David concluded with such delicacy that the following silence seemed sacred. When he stood and turned to the audience, there was no arrogant triumph, just quiet dignity. The ovation was unlike anything that room had witnessed. People rose as if in the presence of something divine. Vincent stood motionless, watching his reputation rewritten in real time. In 15 minutes, David had destroyed the image Vincent spent decades building. "Dr. Webb approached Vincent with disappointment. "I think we need to talk about your contract with our orchestra." Margaret Rothschild pulled out her phone. Vincent knew news of his humiliation would circulate before he left the building. David approached Vincent, extending his hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to play. Sometimes we need to be confronted with our own music to understand who we really are." 6 months later, David walked through Juilliard's halls as a full scholarship student, the youngest in the institution's history. Dr. Webb had personally ensured David received the best opportunities available. Margaret Rothschild, who had mocked him, now personally funded his studies and established a foundation for overlooked musical talents. "That boy taught me that privilege without purpose is just waste," she told the New York Times. Vincent Sterling's contracts were cancelled one by one. The video of David's performance and Vincent's cruel humiliation attempt went viral with devastating comments about prejudice disguised as cultural elitism. 2 years later, David released his first album, which became the best-selling classical music album of the decade. Vincent continued giving private lessons at a community school, his international career permanently destroyed by his own arrogance. The difference wasn't just professional success, but how each used his talent. David used music to lift others, establishing programs in underserved communities. Vincent had used his to elevate himself above others, until he discovered that heights built on prejudice always come crashing down. David's story became legendary, proving that true excellence knows no color, social class, or limitations imposed by those who fear greatness in others. As David always told young students facing discrimination, "The best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to build something greater than they could ever imagine."